Indianapolis. What did they have to say about Joe Mixon, Tee Higgins, and Joe Burrow? Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow. He's your host, James Rapien, coming to you from the NFL Combine this week. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network here on Locked On Bengals, bringing you coverage of your team every day, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts and on YouTube. So hit the subscribe button on YouTube. Follow us anywhere you get your podcasts so you can join the first listen club with the thousands of others of Bengals fans to make Locked On Bengals one of the most listened to team-specific podcasts about an NFL team in the United States. Pretty cool. This episode of Locked On Bengals brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Place your first $5 bet to get a $150 credit for free bets, win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. And James, as it is Combine season and we're hearing from Duke Tobin, we're hearing from Zach Taylor, we're hearing from the coordinators of the Cincinnati Bengals. I'm going to take just one quick moment before we talk about the Joe Burrow contract extension to implore our listeners to please, I beg of you, tune out the fake rumor accounts on Twitter. Just don't engage with them. I don't want to see them on my timeline when people retweet them. Let's just leave them alone. That being said, James, let's talk about the Joe Burrow extension that, of course, it's a formality that every reporter is going to ask at some point of Duke Tobin and Zach Taylor, and they talked about it.
They did, yeah, and it's a matter of when, not if, and I think it's a matter of when this offseason. And that's takeaway number one from the feeling here in Indianapolis is that it's going to get done, that it's going to get done this offseason, and it's just a matter of how it looks, what it looks like. But obviously, and we knew this, right? We've talked about it. It's a priority for this franchise to lock him in long term. They know what he's done, what he's brought them over the past 3 seasons, and certainly the past 2 years, so much success. But it's more than just that. It's about rewarding your own, and Burrow's extension is the start of what we're going to talk about in a theme that's probably going to continue throughout the offseason: retaining your own, extending your own, paying the guys that have gotten you to back-to-back AFC championship games and a Super Bowl appearances, back-to-back AFC North titles for the first time in franchise history. It goes on and on and on, right? Well, that starts with Joe Burrow. And so they're going to get something done. And here's a couple of clips, and I put them together from Tuesday when Duke Tobin was talking about Joe Burrow's potential extension.
It's not done yet. It's a good problem to have. I've been pretty vocal about what Joe means to us, and my job is to facilitate his success as best I can with putting pieces around him, and his contract will get done when it gets done, but it's a good problem to have. He's a vital part of what we're doing. It's a good problem to have. Our quarterback is, we go as he goes, and like I said, it's our job to facilitate his success. He's proven that he can get us there. He's proven that he's a championship caliber quarterback, and but it's not a one-person game, and we have to be ready to put the pieces around him that can facilitate his success.
Duke also said that the Bengals are going to spend to the cap, that they have to put the pieces around, as you heard him say in that clip a couple of times, and pointing out that it's not a one-person game, that it is the entire team. But of course, it does all start with Joe Burrow, who by most measures of productivity is the second best quarterback in terms of efficiency in the NFL. There's certainly an argument that he's the best quarterback in the NFL based on tape and all the other things, and taking a holistic evaluation. But obviously, this extension is going to happen. I don't think we've ever doubted it, right? And so it's a matter of when they get the ducks in a row. They've gone through this experience before. They've made a player the highest paid player in the NFL before, and so that's it, right? They just have to get through the process, figure out what the numbers are, and then Joe Burrow is your quarterback. What the cap implications are this year, next year, and in 3 years, because those are the big 3 years for any extension. And then you can continue on. But I mean, Duke Tobin also said it might not be the first thing to happen, which I found interesting. It tells me that they probably have a framework in place and they have an idea of what those cap implications are going to be. Because if it doesn't come first and you don't know exactly what those implications are, then you would be kind of handcuffed. But it doesn't sound like that's the case either.
Yeah, I think that they certainly have an idea, and there's an understanding that they're going to try to make it work where it's a great deal for Joe, a great deal for the Bengals. The other thing that's interesting when it comes to a deal like this is keeping those weapons, right? And that's something that during the Super Bowl week, what did Jamar Chase say? Oh, Joe knows that he's going to have to take maybe what did he say? I'm paraphrasing, but it was like
he knows how he's going to structure his deal to keep some of his weapons around him.
Structure it a certain way. Yeah. And I think that that's exactly right. And I think that that's exactly what Duke and everyone's with the Bengals feels. And the other part of this is Duke added that this negotiation, he was around for the Carson extension and around for the Dalton extension, and that it doesn't feel much different. The numbers are just much, much bigger. And obviously Joe Burrow is a bigger star than Carson ever was. And Andy wasn't in that caliber, that range of quarterback when he was getting paid. He was never going to reset the quarterback market, even though he got a sizable deal that either of us would happily take any time. It's not in the $500 million waters that they are now. And so it's going to be interesting to see what the deal looks like, but no doubt in my mind that a deal gets done. And maybe it's not the first thing. I also think it's first on that priority list. So I would not be shocked if it came down by the time you're hearing this, right? It wouldn't shock me. I don't think that's going to happen, but would it shock you? I think it could happen anytime, and it also might not get done until May, but I think it's going to get done at some point. Yeah,
they're playing coy a little bit as far as it's not done yet. We don't know when it'll be done. They are not really giving much up there, but it does sound like, to me, it sounds like there's at least a framework in place, and they're working on details. That's kind of what it sounds like to me, and we could be wrong about that, right? We're only hearing one perspective here, and so we're only getting the Bengals side of this. The other Duke Tobin quote that I wanted to hit on as it pertains to Joe Burrow was on a radio show, like Sirius XM NFL radio or something like that. I think you put the clip on your site, James. Duke Tobin was talking about how he gets ideas from Joe Burrow, and they have that what's the word I want? Collaborative relationship where there is a lot of dialogue between Duke Tobin, the de facto GM for the Bengals, and Joe Burrow in terms of what would make him more comfortable. Some of the things that he may or may not want around him. They're running ideas off of each other, which, you've heard around the league, quarterbacks feeling like they want more input, want to make sure their voices are heard. It sounds like the Bengals are doing a good job of that with Joe. Not that we've ever doubted that. That's kind of the message that we've heard from Burrow and the front office over the years, but it's nice to hear that again from Duke Tobin this week, that, it's not just bouncing ideas off of Joe. He's getting some ideas from him too, which hopefully, I think Joe Burrow's a pretty smart guy, probably some pretty good ideas.
For sure. And I think it is that collaborative nature and the open-mindedness of the organization and this coaching staff. And I think Duke and Zach, they see really eye to eye. And anytime you're investing in a quarterback at the range, money-wise, years-wise, you should value his opinion. And I think that Burrow's mature enough to obviously deal with that. So it is interesting that he mentioned that on Sirius XM NFL radio. And I will say this, Duke, I like edgy Duke. I like Duke Tobin, who's willing to dish it out a little bit. And up next, you'll hear that because he dished it out when it came to Tee Higgins and Tee Higgins' future, which we've talked about here on the show. And obviously we were a little surprised about some of the rumblings, maybe not surprised, but they got annoying, and they clearly annoyed Duke. So you'll hear from him coming up next. Today's show brought to you by FanDuel, one-stop shop for all things sports wagering. You download FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, and get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download FanDuel Sportsbook. Download the app today. It's safe, secure, easy to use. And whether you want to wager on the Warriors, Steph Curry making his way back, or you think that the Lakers, where they're going to go into tanking mode without LeBron James, you can do all of those things at FanDuel right now. So don't miss your chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA.
We've been talking about Tee Higgins this offseason primarily in terms of an extension when it comes to things that are on the Bengals' mind. But when it comes to things that are on the mind of other fans and of national media who watched the Tennessee Titans deal A.J. Brown for draft picks, they're talking about, oh, why wouldn't the Bengals consider trading Tee Higgins? That seems like something that you would do with a second round draft pick going into his fourth year. He's under contract. He's cost controlled. You might not be able to bring him back. You might be able to bring him back. Maybe they'll extend him this offseason. But if they can't, shouldn't the Bengals consider trading him and trying to get a haul of draft picks? And then they come back when they're like, the Bengals can't afford to pay 2 number 1 receivers. I'll give you a second round pick for Tee Higgins. This receiver you can't afford to pay. Not only can you not afford to pay him, he's only worth a second round pick. Pick one, guys. Third round pick, maybe, if you're getting into the crazier fans out there. Point is, for us on this podcast, it's been exactly what Duke Tobin said about this. Tee Higgins is under contract next year. The Bengals are trying to win a Super Bowl next year. Why would they trade him? He's a very important part of the offense. That is not the Bengals' way of doing business. So for us on this podcast, James, this has been, to use Duke's word, ridiculous since it started, and it still is. And clearly the Bengals brass feels the same way.
He's the third most valuable player on their offense. It's what he is. Burrow, Chase, then Higgins. And if this pass first team is going to get over the hump and win a Super Bowl, unless you're finding a better version of Tee Higgins in the draft, spoiler, you're not, then yeah, absolutely you keep him and you try to make this run and you try to extend him, by the way, and lock him up for the next few years. He's only 24. And so you have a 23-year-old Jamar Chase. Happy birthday, Jamar, by the way. He turned 23 on Wednesday. Tee Higgins, 24. If you can keep those guys together, you do it. And I like that Duke said, get your own, and was very – look, there was a reason we came out and dismissed it. And I wrote about it on All Bengals as well. And it wasn't just me making up things. You talk to people, and there was never ever the idea, the thought, even the floating of a thought of trading him this offseason. And instead of me going on and on about it, let's hear from Duke Tobin.
He's a good player for us, and I just in my mind, why would I want to give up a good player for us? He's a valuable component of what we do. We drafted him for a reason. We've developed him for a reason. He plays for a reason. He's under contract to us. He gives us the best chance to be a successful football team. And like I said, earlier, I'm not in the business of trying to figure out how to make other teams better. I'm in the business of trying to keep our team at the top. Maybe, maybe not, but they're under contract right now, and you might have thought that far ahead and wanna start breaking down our team, but I don't think that way. I really don't. He's a big part of what we do. He gels great with our quarterback. He's a great piece of what we've developed on offense, and we're not looking to start over right now. We look at a lot of different things. We also look at the fact that what he does for us as a football team, and he's under contract next year, and we'll talk to him perhaps as the offseason goes on and see if there's something we can come to an agreement on or not. He's eligible for that. It's not a necessity, but it's something that can be done, and we'll see. It sounds like you thought a lot more about this than I have. I don't overthink it. He's a good player for the Cincinnati Bengals, and I intend to keep him that way.
A few interesting notes there. One, aligns with everything we've said, right? He's under contract for the Bengals next year. He's an important part of the offense. They don't think about, he might not be on the team in a couple years. We better get an asset for it, at least in this kind of window, right? And there is merit, I think, to saying, well, maybe you should trade an asset when you can get maximum value for it. But that is not this scenario. It's applicable, but there's specific things about where the Bengals are right now in their team cycle, in their Super Bowl cycle, or whatever you want to call it, where just why would you trade away Tee Higgins? And this, to me, just confirms that this is just a covetous thing that, fans from other teams, they want Tee Higgins. And I get it. I would want Tee Higgins on my team too if I needed a wide receiver. But the Bengals just clearly, to me, were never going to really entertain. I mean, think back to Carson Palmer. He wasn't even playing for them and they didn't want to trade him until they were really blown away.
Sure. They're not going to be forced into anything. And Jesse Bates is the prime example of this, right? I mean, they know more likely than not that Jesse's going to leave this offseason, probably be on a new team in 2 weeks and sign a big money deal and be elsewhere. They kept him around. Why? Because they wanted to win this year. Well, T's more valuable than Jesse. So why would you expect anything different? And by the way, it's the right decision. I think that the Bengals Super Bowl window would be much shorter, smaller, whatever you want to say, their chances of winning next year without Tee Higgins, regardless of how you replace him. I think it would be really hard to do. I did ask Zach Taylor a quick question about Tee, and it's funny that he went right into the trade rumors. As a play caller, how nice has it been to have Tee Higgins on the opposite side of Jamar Chase?
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it's that's why whenever you see the rumors floating around there, it's nonsense because at the end of the day, I do get to call the plays, and it's fun having weapons out there, and you don't really want to give those up.
So you just laugh that off?
I do. Yes, I do.
What else would you do, right? I mean, what are we doing here? Of course you laugh it off. I get it, Zach.
Yeah, he laughs it off like we laugh it off. And yet it wasn't all laughter at the combine. You know, that there's just two good things, right? Tee Higgins is going to be around. The Bengals are going to try to extend him. I think it's fair to say that. Certainly they plan on getting a Joe Burrow extension done. What about the other Joe Mixon? Let's discuss him, and you also have some cap figures that we can dive into coming up next year on Locked On Bengals.
While there was, in my opinion, clarity on Tee Higgins, conviction on Joe Burrow, those two guys, their future to the front office, at least for next year, and in Joe Burrow's case, the future beyond next year is clear. For Joe Mixon, the picture is a little bit murkier. And this does tie in to like James said, the salary cap situation that the Bengals find themselves in. Assuming they do want to extend Joe Burrow and Tee Higgins, which it sounds like the Tee Higgins extension, and again, you can never take these guys fully at face value, maybe not as high on the priority list. Duke Tobin saying, we don't need to get that done. We'll see if we can. It kind of casts some doubt on that, especially knowing the agent there, that may not happen this offseason. Not nearly as much for Joe Mixon in terms of he's part of this team going forward. He's part of this team next year. In fact, when asked directly about whether Joe Mixon will be on the team next year, both Zach Taylor and Duke Tobin had nice things to say about what Joe Mixon has done for the Cincinnati Bengals. But when they could have said Joe's going to be the running back for the Cincinnati Bengals next year, they did not. The answer was
Joe's been a good player for us, and he's been a pretty key component for what we're doing. And I can't predict what the offseason, will do. I can't predict, what other deals will get done, how much money we'll need. There might be a chance to renegotiate some people on our team. There might be a chance to extend some people on our team. Again, there's a lot of moving pieces to this. I think the blanket statement I can make is when you have a good player who is productive, you do what you can to try to keep them on your football team. And that's what we'll do. And we'll see how the offseason plays. I just can't predict it as I stand here right now.
And I think that's fair because they may have an idea of what they're going to do, Jake, but until you have the replacement or you have a clearer picture of the cap, of exactly how this plays out, of who they keep, of who they don't, why make that decision now? And I guess you could say, well, you do it to give Joe a chance at landing elsewhere. Well, they might not have that in their mind. They may want to try to go the pay cut route, not necessarily the restructure, but the pay cut with Mixon. And it's going to be interesting. I think it's the biggest true storyline following this team outside of the Burrow contract. Obviously, we can talk about the draft, who they keep, who they don't in free agency. But Joe Mixon, what do they do with him? That's certainly a big question going into this offseason and going into, obviously, free agency and the draft.
And something to me that's telling about the way Duke talked about Joe Mixon, as you listen to that clip, if you go listen, on James's YouTube page or something like that, Cincinnati Bengals talk to how Duke Tobin talked about Jermaine Pratt, how Duke Tobin talked about Jesse Bates, it's not all that different, even though Joe Mixon is under contract next year.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's talking about them as guys that are important parts of the team, players they like. They were on the team because the Bengals thought highly of them, to use Duke Tobin's terminology. But, you know, you can't keep everyone. And Duke Tobin specifically mentioning we don't know what kind of money we'll need.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, refers specifically to cap space. That really stands out to me. And like you said, James, I think, you know, they certainly would approach him about, hey, do you want to rework a deal? We talked to Andre about this a couple weeks ago now, an incentive-based deal, you know, these sorts of things are options for the Bengals and Joe Mixon to rework his deal, to rework the cap hit. But when we look at the cap numbers, which we'll do in a second here, they need to make cap space, in my opinion. There's no real way around that, even though they're talked about as one of the teams with the most cap space in the NFL. When you start to look at the actual obligations they're going to have coming up, and we'll talk about this, they will need to create space. And Joe Mixon is where everyone is looking right now as an obvious way to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's an obvious way, and it's a position that in this draft you can find guys that can run fast and break tackles. And, well, Joe Mixon's not your pass protection back, right? So it's a way to keep a reliable piece in Samaje Perine as well. That said, Joe Mixon's agent's here, so maybe they are talking. Maybe he's driving to Cincinnati afterwards to renegotiate that deal. Who knows? You never know. But that's me just purely speculating. I'm not saying that's.
You got to go find him at a steakhouse, James, tonight. Right. Go find the agent.
That's right. I could. He actually walked through here a little bit ago. I'm recording at the Bengals hotel, but it's a huge question mark. And yet when you go through these numbers, I think it's much clearer why there's so much smoke around a potential move involving number 28.
Yeah. So when you look at where the Bengals are in cap space right now, the numbers are like $35 million or so in adjusted cap space as of today. But say they extend Joe Burrow, which we expect. And let's say for the first set of numbers here that they extend Tee Higgins as well. Those don't have massive implications on the cap this year in 2023, but it does lead to moderate increases in the cap number for both of those guys because the signing bonus that they get is prorated over the life of the deal. And so some of that money comes in to the current year. You know, it'll come into the current year of the extension. They also, I think we agree, James, are very likely to sign a tight end, a safety, a running back two, probably, or unless they don't cut Mixon, in which case, you know, maybe they roll with a guy in the draft, a backup quarterback. These are all positions that currently are not filled for the Bengals: starting tight end, starting safety, RB2, backup quarterback for next year. So you assume, say they pay guys 10% more at those positions than they paid guys this year. So like Hurst, Bell, Perine, Allen, for example. It doesn't have to be those players, but say whoever they are, get modest raises to account for the inflation of the salary cap compared to last year. Then you account for rookies, which is about $2.5 million. You account for the practice squad, which is around $3 million. You account for some bonus payouts, which is off-season payouts that will count against the cap. That gets up to $6.5 million. You throw all those things into the pot. That leaves the Bengals at $5.3 million in cap space. If they don't cut anyone, if they don't rework any deals, and $5.3 million when you still have to fill out the back of your roster with guys like Trent Taylor, with guys like Joe Bacci, with guys that are going to be in training camp with you, with guys that are going to be on the 53-man roster potentially, that space gets really narrow really quickly. And so, you know, maybe they don't get the Tee Higgins extension done, you would say. Okay, maybe they're up to $8 million instead of $5 million. But it's close, right? It gets really tight. And that's kind of the indication that they need to make some space. I think they will make some space because there's not a Bengals team in my history I think that would be comfortable with getting to that little cap space that early in the offseason with just bringing back some of their own guys and still having holes to fill in the roster.
Exactly. I mean, there's just they know that they need to make a run here and that the entire coaching staff is back and that this window is open. And so that's why you want to keep some of these guys, but you're going to have to make some tough decisions or move some money around. And I think they're aware of it, and it's going to be interesting how they go about it, Jake. And we can spend more time on it, and we will, of course, about the cap situation. But number 28, all eyes on him and what his future could mean in Cincinnati because of the numbers you just relayed there. Because I think they would love to get a Higgins extension done. Obviously Burrow, obviously maybe a Logan Wilson. They would love to get some of these guys under contract. And so if you do that and retain some of those free agents or add guys to replace free agents that leave, it gets tight really quick. And I think they're going to do their best to avoid that. Not that they won't spend all of their cap or most of their cap, right? I think they will, but I don't think that it's going to be without making some moves to give them some more room.
Seems like it's just necessary. The way the numbers look right now, it appears to be necessary. I don't know if they know exactly what it'll look like yet. We'll see what happens here with their own guys, with guys they're trying to bring back, with the extensions that you just talked about, James. And there are going to be other stories to talk about too. Lou Anarumo, Brian Callahan, and Darren Simmons all talked to the media today, in addition to Frank Pollock, today being Wednesday. So we'll have that to talk about for you guys in our next episode, as James is still going to be at the Combine. And we'll wrap up some of our Combine coverage there. And then next week, in case you're looking ahead and you're like, what about all the workouts? Well, we're going to be joined by Mike Renner early next week to talk about some of the big takeaways from the Combine. And that's going to be a lot of fun too. So until next time, Bengals fans, thanks for listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast with James coming to you from the Combine. Hoo day, and have a good one.